Uh, Hello, everyone. Good morning or have a nice noon. Depends where you are at the moment in different countries. But we can start with our EUROSTUDENT Talks webinar. I'm very happy to welcome you all here. And today we are focusing on student funding, more precisely on the relationship between student funding policies and student welfare. And for that, I'm very happy to have here Krzysztof Czarnecki from Poland originally, but he has been doing his research in very many different places. And at the moment, Krzysztof is an assistant professor at the University of Poznan in the economics and business department. And his research interests include student funding, inequalities in higher education, and social policy. And I think that Krzysztof can also a bit later tell more about himself and his research, of course, but I won't make the introduction long. And I will just say that as always at EUROSTUDENT Talks, you're absolutely welcome to post your comments and questions in the chat, and you can also raise your hand and join in with your video and audio. So feel free, and we will take the questions later on as well. But I think this is enough from the intro side, and I will give the screen or the floor to Krzysztof himself. So hello, Krzysztof, and you can start.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Marlene, for this introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk.
We can at the moment see this present.
Can you see it?
View, yeah. You can start a slideshow and then I can tell you. At the moment, I can see the presenter's view, like the current slide and the next slide. We tested it yesterday. Somehow it worked, I remember.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Anyways.
Can we do it like this with this?
We can do it, for me, we can do it like this as well. Like, I don't mind.
Yeah, sorry, I'm in a new office from since yesterday and haven't really tested the communication between my laptop and the monitor. Yeah, anyway, going back to the beginning, I'd like to present to you today the idea and first preliminary findings of the study on the relationship between student funding policy and student welfare, which I have started to conduct during my research stay at the ZHW in Hanover, and which was financed by the German Academic Exchange Service. And the study envisages an extensive use of EUROSTUDENT data on the macro level, indicators on the macro level, as the best possible source of information on student welfare. Key clarification at the beginning, what is actually student funding policy, because it may not be that clear. So this policy, in my conceptualization, it concerns state-determined arrangements regarding student grants or scholarships, as well as loans, but also tax benefits and allowances for the families of students, typically their parents, as well as the system of tuition fees functioning in a given country. In the project, I tried to tackle the questions, I mean, a few questions. The main one, whether students in countries with more generous policy have higher total incomes. Do they receive less money from parents or earn less on the labor market? And eventually, how effective are different funding policies in reducing student economic hardship? Here's the outline of my presentation, and I will start from a short introduction of the data that I have collected at Stockholm University, and which I use to measure and compare student funding policies. Then I will move to the main topic and present you the study design and go through some first explorative calculations, which I have done so far. And finally, I will discuss some obstacles in investigating these issues of student poverty or economic well-being using EUROSTUDENT data. And then I will outline the ideas I have for future research. Let me begin with this graph showing the relationship of different types of data used in comparative social policy research. I adapted it to the context of student funding, and it shows how our policy data are different from other types of data or indicators measuring student support and tuition fees. We conceive funding policy as student social rights in the form of legally determined eligibility and entitlement to student support. Eligibility concerns who has access to different types of support, and it can be based on educational participation. So having student status is obviously a prerequisite for being eligible for student funding, but it can also be based on merit or need, most typically family income. And entitlements are about the access to what those eligible students actually have. And entitlements can be means tested, so the amount of support students receive can depend on their income or their parents' income, or it can be flat rate. So, you know, everyone eligible gets basically the same amount of money. And all those eligibility and entitlement issues can concern three main types of student support. First is the direct support, which goes directly to students in the form of grants. Then there is or scholarships. Then there is something we call indirect support, and that's the money that goes to parents, not to students. So, for example, tax benefits or family allowances. And then we have a repayable type of support, and these are obviously student loans. Next, all those social rights are diminished by obligations to pay tuition fees. So our social right indicator is considering both the benefit side and the cost side all together. So we have a certain net outcome of student funding policy. And these social rights are obviously written in law, so they can be thought of as direct policy outputs. And the way these social rights are determined sets up the certain real presence of student funding in the student body, or like the share of students in receipt of different forms of support and the amounts they receive. This is a kind of a data that we call the benefit recipiency data. And it's something that can be derived from the EUROSTUDENT survey, right? So like how many students actually get different types of student funding, and what's the average amount of money they receive. However, the values of these statistics not only depend on the social rights, so how these things are written in law, but also on some external factors, such as the structure of student population and the supply of study places. So these indicators are kind of contaminated by the context, and thus they do not reflect the policy itself, but rather it's the policy outcome. And finally, benefit recipiency translates into the final policy outcome, that is public social expenditure on student funding. So this is eventually how much is being spent from public sources on this policy. And this indicator is even more problematic, which I could talk about later. So basically, we collected the social rights type of data on eligibility and entitlements to student support and obligations to pay tuition fees for 32 countries in years 2005, 2010, and 2015. And the collection will continue with 2020 data. We are almost ready at this point. And how do we actually calculate those indicators? So all those social rights and obligations to pay tuition fees are calculated for 3 model type families that differ only in income and employment status of parents. So these are like kind of hypothetical model type families. And so we analyze the legislation and we try to establish what would be the benefits and the fees that the students from those families would have to pay. And this is a standard way, taking those model type families, of assuring comparability of indicators in the social policy indicators database at Stockholm University, which our data, student support and fees data set, is a part of. There are lots of assumptions involved in this data collection, and I can go back to them if you wish, as well as to a country example showing how we arrive at every indicator value step by step. For now, it is most important for you to know that the final indicator of generosity of student funding policy is calculated as total benefits, so grants, plus student allowance, plus indirect support, minus tuition fees, divided by family income for each of the 3 model type families. And then this country level indicator is the average indicator that we arrive at for each of those 3 model type families, which as I said before, they differ in the income. And the reference income is just like in the OECD, it's the average production workers' wage. And using this data, I recently published a paper in which I developed, here is this title, Political Party Families and Student Social Rights. And I developed in it new concepts for comparative student funding research that reflect the social policy aims underpinning different systems. And if we have time later, and if you're interested, I could talk about this research. But yeah, that's more about the context of how we actually conceptualize and then operationalize student funding policy. But now, and now having introduced what student funding policy is and how we measure it, also in this research, the findings of which I'm going to present to you today, I can move to the main topic, in which I ask 3 pretty simple questions. First, what is the impact of this student funding policy on student objective and subjective economic well-being? By objective economic well-being, I mean their income levels, and by subjective, I mean their perception of the financial difficulties they encounter. Second question concerns the impact of student funding policy on student welfare mix. Welfare mix is the structure of student budgets. So from which sources they draw their income from. And we distinguish three main sources of student income, which is parents, state, so public support, and third, labor, so self-earned income. And then thirdly, I ask, can the relationship between student funding policy and economic well-being be explained by the adjustments in student welfare mix? So this question relates to the potential substitution effects between different sources of welfare of students. So for example, more support to students may not necessarily increase their total income, but decrease their reliance on parents or reduce their labor instead of increasing their total income. Hence, the final effect of funding on total income can depend on how income from other sources is adjusted by students who are entitled to funding. So now, why is this important? First of all, less state funding or insufficient state funding can lead to students being forced to spend more time at work. And this in turn can lead to worse study outcomes, dropout, failing to graduate on time, and so on and so on. If the funding is insufficient, students don't have enough money, they have to rely on parental support to more extent, and this could have detrimental effects on their feeling of individual autonomy or well-being. Another adverse consequence of not enough funding is obviously worse economic well-being as such, right? So higher poverty rates among students once other income sources are limited. So when they cannot compensate for the lack of state support by getting more money from parents or earning more on the labor market. And naturally, higher poverty rates can also have a whole range of adverse consequences, including all those that I mentioned before. But on the other hand, more state funding can result in more public expenditures. And if state funding does not produce positive effects on well-being, economic or any other outcomes we can think of, then we can talk about potential inefficiencies in the area of this policy. So that's the first thing. And then in the context of the topic is even more important in the current context of growing social inequalities, rising costs of living, especially rising housing costs, and increasing budgetary pressures on higher education, given other fiscal priorities related to the pandemic context or geopolitical situation. And then also what matters, especially for the potential consequences of student loans on their economic well-being, is that they may face problems with debt repayments in the situation in which there is a saturation on graduate labor markets, which is really the case in some countries, and which is obviously related to the falling rates of return from higher education. Despite the importance of this topic, there have been very little attempts to investigate it, especially in a cross-country comparative approach. Of works conducted so far and using data from more than one country, the introduction of youth welfare mix and youth social citizenship concepts is probably, at least in my opinion, the most notable. And this research conducted by Lorenza Antonucci and Tom Chevalier primarily emphasized country differences in sources of student welfare and their consequences for the process of transition to independent adulthood, not only for students but young adults more generally. So the focus of that country comparative studies has never been students. It always concerned young adults more generally, and this comparative study that we have been conducting is the first one that focuses on students solely. Furthermore, some researchers have shown that there are substitution effects between intergenerational money transfers within families and public provisions. So this is something that I already mentioned, right? So like we may expect that that by giving students more money, increasing financial aid allocated to them, they may not necessarily improve their objective economic well-being, so the total income they receive, but rather they may decide to reduce the parental transfers they receive. And this substitution effect, especially if we consider also labor income, hasn't been really analyzed in a satisfactory manner in the context of students. Furthermore, some other research shows that the impact of public transfers on student labor is unclear. So there are various findings, some showing that more student support reduces student labor, others showing that it doesn't matter, and others show that it actually decreases student labor. And others underline that this relationship between public transfers and student labor may depend on funding composition. So the extent to which the whole financial aid packages consists of loans, grants, and family support. So those three types of grants, types of benefits that I introduced earlier. So at this initial stage of the research, I took a cross-country comparative approach, and therefore I used country-level indicators. This means that I'm interested here in whether country differences in student welfare are related to country differences in student funding policy, okay? And this macro approach obviously faces many problems of statistical nature, including aggregation paradox. So, and we also ignore specificity of some systems. We disregard student heterogeneity. We are just interested in the aggregate effects as we can see them in the form of those country-level indicators. However, this is the first preliminary step of this whole research project, and I think it's a useful starting point for just initially explore the data. Now we unfortunately have only 2 time points that we can use, and that's matching the data from the EUROSTUDENT 5 and the student funding data that we created for 2010. And then matching a second time series, EUROSTUDENT 6, with the student funding data from 2015. But in a quite near future, we're going to have 4 time points, which also including EUROSTUDENT 7, 8, and the new upcoming rounds of the student support and fees data set. And this would hopefully allow us more robust, taking a more robust analytical approach. And depending on the year and focus, we have around 20 countries participating in the EUROSTUDENT, which are available for the analysis. I measured the concept of interest. So when it comes to student funding policy, we have 3 major operationalizations. The first one is the generosity of student funding. So that's total support to all those types of benefits, net of tuition fees as a share of family income. Yeah, so it's always a percentage of the family income after adding up all types of support and deducting the tuition fees that students from the model type families have to pay. The second version of this indicator is what we call defamilisation. I don't have time now to introduce the theoretical background to this concept and to the concept of decommodification, which is the name of the third indicator we use, because that was the topic of my previous research that I already mentioned. But for now, I think it's enough to say that this defamilization is basically proxying the direct student funding. So So it's like this main indicator, but disregarding indirect support. So here we include only the money that goes directly to student pockets, on the assumption that it can support them to become more independent from their families, to start up the independent living. And the third indicator is decommodification, and that in turn disregards student loans. So we take into account only non-repayable type of support, and we divide it not by the family income, but by the minimum standard of living, as proxied by 76% of average wage. And economic well-being is operationalized using the EUROSTUDENT data. Here we have the objective measure, which is the average total income, including transfer in kind, expressed in purchasing power parity for bachelor students only. So that's average total income for students in a given country. And then we have the subjective measure, which is the average share of students experiencing financial difficulties, or in another version, the share of students not experiencing financial difficulties. And this concerns all students, so not only the bachelor ones. And here I should note that the total income data for samples, including all students, are available only since EUROSTUDENT 6, unfortunately. Hence, the analysis of objective economic well-being concerns only bachelor students not living with parents. So that's one of the data limitations that we have in general with the EUROSTUDENT. And only in the most recent versions of it, actually, full student population is being sampled in all countries. The welfare mix is measured as the average share of total income received from either family or labor or state by the students in a given country. And then in the regression models, I account for a few control variables, most notably gross national income. Now we'll proceed straight to the findings relating to the research questions I introduced before. And first I will show you the scatter plots depicting the relationship in question and providing the information on the effect size in regression, controlling for gross national income only, because other control variables, quite surprisingly, prove not to be correlated with student welfare. So the share of part-time students, for example, was not correlated at all with student welfare in a given country. Note that this analysis, I reiterate, relates only to students not living with their parents. This is what this NLVP shortcut stands for. And what we see here on the scatter plot is that students have, on average, higher total incomes in countries with more generous student funding policy. Yeah, so this is probably something that we would expect to find. And the same applies to the defamilization measure. So also this direct student support, right? So here we disregard the money that we call, indirect support, those benefits that go to families, not to students themselves. The relationship is pretty much the same. However, whatever student funding policy measure we take into account, these relationships are quite weak. I mean, considering the gross national income, we see that betas are around 30 only. And furthermore, we seem to have some counterfactual cases in which this relationship between the funding generosity and the student total income doesn't seem to hold. So, for example, Denmark has very generous student funding policy, but the average total income of Danish students is not really corresponding to that funding that they receive. And the same applies to Hungary, whereas, for example, Ireland, Romania, or Latvia in 2015 had surprisingly relatively high average total incomes among students, despite direct student funding in those countries being very, very meager in relative terms. So it's statistically significant, it's positive, this relationship, but it's, there are some doubts. Let's now try to see whether this positive relationship can be explained by the way student support affects the welfare mix of students. And for this, we first need to establish whether our student funding indicators are actually related to the extent of reliance on different sources of welfare. Here we see that there is a quite strong relationship between generosity of student funding, so this total indicator, this main one, and the reliance on parental transfers. The effect size doesn't change if we exclude indirect support. So higher entitlements to grants and loans for students are associated quite clearly with smaller shares of parental transfers in total student income. Okay. And what logically follows, this generosity of student funding is associated with higher shares of public support in total student income. And even more so if we disregard indirect support. I don't show the relationship between student funding policy and the share of income from student work because surprisingly, these variables turn out to be unrelated. Also, if we consider time at work instead of income from work. So it seems that when it comes to the welfare mix, the relationship between the welfare mix and the student funding policy, the only important relationships actually occur between funding and the amount that students get from their parents. Further explore if student funding affects to the total student income through the way it changes the share of family or public support in student budgets. I run mediation models within the structural equation modeling framework. And as far as defamilization is considered, so this direct student funding, I didn't find an evidence for such mechanism, but I did so once I modified this measure by disregarding student loans and with regard to the reliance on family support mediator only, so the share of family transfers. So entitlements to non-repayable grants, let me remind you again, net of tuition fees, right? Entitlements to non-repayable grants are associated with lower shares of family transfers in student welfare mix in their budgets, and this in turn is associated with higher student total incomes. What does it mean? I suggest that we can interpret this as a consequence of entitlements to grants supporting transition to independent adulthood. So they allow students to reduce financial ties with parents, and this is associated with the need for having more income since occasional in-kind support from parents becomes less desirable or possible. And at the same time, with the need for having more income from both state support, so they can make use of the entitlements they have actually, but also possibly from student work, but probably to a lesser extent because we didn't really find a positive relationship between the generosity of student funding and the amount of money students get from their labor. So so this is a provisional conclusion, and it should be treated as such, right? So a take on how we can actually explain this positive relationship that we found between the student funding policy and the total student income, as long as we are interested, obviously, only in explaining the cross-country differences. And the provisionality of this finding obviously stems from a lot of data limitations, of which having only 2 time series at this point is only one problem. Finally, a short note on the second research question that I posed. I mean, the version of the first research question that concerns the relationship between student funding policy and subjective economic well-being. So not the total student income, but the percentage of students who experience financial difficulties. And perhaps surprisingly, I didn't find such relationship to exist. And that's regardless the type of funding policy indicator that I use once we control for gross national income. Hence, it doesn't seem to be the case that students are less likely to report experiencing financial difficulties in countries where student funding policy is more generous. So yeah, so that's pretty much when it comes to the findings of this, at least at this stage, in which we explore the cross-country differences in welfare.
Yes, thank you, Christoph, for this insight. You already mentioned some certain countries when showing us the graphs before, but could you also illustrate this overview of the situation with some country cases? I mean, like both the typical cases maybe, or some outstanding examples. I think it would be interesting. Like if you were doing the analysis, did some countries somehow stood out?
Yeah, so like, for example, in the context of the reliance on public transfers, this is pretty, so we see the positive relationship. So that's like the relationship between the generosity of student funding policy and the share of public transfers in total student income. And yeah, that's just, you know, we witness another case of Nordic exceptionalism here, driving the results in social policy comparative studies, because you see clearly that almost all countries that we see as standing out in the share of public transfers and total income of students are the Nordic ones, right? So that's like the first obvious observation when it comes to the kind of, you know, data structure. But this, yeah, and so obviously it poses a question whether this relationship would still hold if we exclude the Nordic countries, but so whether they should be treated as outliers or not. In my opinion, they should definitely not be treated as outliers, because they are actually a very important cases in which the student funding policy is generous. So they precisely demonstrate what happens if we have very supportive funding policy for students. So rather than seeing them as outliers, I would rather call them very influential, important cases that tell us something about what can we expect if we increase generosity of student funding. And then on the other hand, when it comes to differences in total student income, we see clear gaps between the Western and Central Eastern Europe, or the old EU members and new EU members, perhaps with some exceptions. So it's still pretty much the case, with some exceptions of like Denmark and perhaps Hungary to some extent. Students in the Central Eastern Europe on average have clearly lower total income as expressed in purchasing power parity as the students from the Western Europe. But, you know, I mean, this again relates to the data problems, right? Because we also know that that the average age of students in the Western countries is higher than in the Eastern countries. So this could be something that can partly explain the fact that they have higher total incomes, right? Because the income, it tends to increase with age. So yeah, and as I said before, we are not able at this point to account for student heterogeneity. So do the same analysis for specific groups of students. And finally, when it comes to the share of parental transfers in total student income, yeah, we can spot some usual suspects here, right? So, for example, we see Italy in 2015 as the country with the highest share of family income in total income, but also some other countries that we tend to kind of associate with a very important role of family in the society also score high on this variable, which speaks good, I think, about the data quality. So Romania, Portugal, or Latvia are also here with a relatively higher share of parental transfers. Yeah, but there's also a relationship with the gross national income. So, like, to what extent this is more a cultural thing, and to what extent it's more an economic explanation that we need to understand those cross-country differences is still an open question that has to be investigated.
Yeah, thank you, Christoph. Before we move on to your future research plans and also problems with the data, there is one question in the chat from Yasin. I think you can also see it yourself. But Yasin is asking, how did you take into account some socio-demographic characteristics of the student population, like age, having children, housing, and so on, in your models and interpretations? And he is asking this because total income can be okay, or on the contrary, very low, depending on expenditure, which also depends on socio-demographics.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I said, we are only interested in this first explorative stage in the aggregate outcomes. So we totally disregard student heterogeneity whatsoever. So it's, yeah. And that's also like the problem with the data that I should perhaps mention right now with the EUROSTUDENT data, because if we would like to study these issues of student welfare on the on this disaggregated level and account for all those specificities that have just been mentioned in the question, right? Then we would have to use the microdata. And the microdata, at least in the current form, are only available from the EUROSTUDENT 7. And furthermore, in the in this EUROSTUDENT 7, this total income is categorized in a way that basically poses a lot of problems for this type of analysis, right? So this is the example of Poland. And here you can see the variable, the relationship between the total income in euro per month and income from public sources in euro per month. And this is how this income data are coded at this point in the micro. It's like every 200 euros. And then you end up, we basically end up with not enough variation to conduct a sensible disaggregated analysis of student welfare. So I'm afraid that to fully account for this for the student diversity that you mentioned, we will have to focus only on few countries and get the access to real micro data in the raw form, and not rely on what is actually provided in the data infrastructure for the EUROSTUDENT. So that's unfortunately a serious obstacle.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Seems that at the moment not, but Christoph, could you also tell us a bit what are your future plans for the research? How will you continue with your findings?
Yeah, so as I said, this is a kind of a first very preliminary stuff that we've been doing right now, and we think about moving this research agenda forward. So first of all, we were waiting for more time series that would allow us to deal with some current data problems. Yeah, so it would be, yeah, we will be, at least we will be able to account for the country level specificity better if we have 4 point observations and not 2 as it is right now. And also more and better microdata would also be needed if we would like to tackle those student welfare problems seriously. But also we could analyze microdata from this EUROSTUDENT 7 and EUROSTUDENT 8 by in this research context by replacing policy variables with benefit recipiency and do it country by country in order to seek the regularities between the findings and student funding policy variables. What I mean here is that you know, in the introduction I told you about those different student funding policy indicators that can be used in studies, in analysis. So the question that we could potentially answer is also to what extent this funding policy as we measure as social rights actually translates into benefit recipients, right? So on the basis of the microdata, we would like to calculate those benefit recipiency indicators. So like, you know, the share of students in receipt of different benefits and the average amount of benefits that they receive. Furthermore, but I know that that some people from DZHW and Hanover are doing that already. It would be interesting to study the relationship between student funding policy and income inequalities, right? So because now I showed you some results for the impact on student welfare, but one could also study for the impact on income inequalities, right? And ask, for example, the question that, is there any redistributive effects taking place? And can we see the differences between the countries which distribute the aid more equally? So, for example, the support is flat rate and is available for most of the students, like it is in the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries. And the countries in which the support is very means tested, right? So it's available only for the few and only for the for the poorest. Yeah. So like what the decision on how this is organized, this distribution of social rights, the targeting of those has an impact on income inequalities among the student body. So that's another very interesting research question that we think about tackling. And then we could also treat student welfare, so this economic well-being, as a mediator of the relationship between student funding policy and higher education participation. Yeah. So here we would have a question: can we first, if there is a relationship between student funding policy and participation rate or enrollment rates, if you like, and then can this relationship be explained by students being better off financially in countries which provide more generous support? So these are just a few ideas that we have with you know, are about continuing our work with the EUROSTUDENT data in the context of student funding policy. But if there are any other interesting problems that that you can think of as important to address by the researchers, that I would be very thankful for telling me about them.
Yes, I'm just reflecting on the thoughts in the chat as well, that Elizabeth also said that it's very important that researchers share their perspective and their experience on using the microdata, and it's also like problems with that. And I think that it's definitely very valuable that we have researchers here in EUROSTUDENT webinars as well, because on one side, people who are interested in different topics in the field of higher education can come and find out what is being done on the research field. But on the other hand, it's also the reflection to EUROSTUDENT data people that how researchers see the data, what could be the problems, what could be improved. I think it's definitely very important and very valuable.
Yeah, so maybe as a follow-up to this point, I can say that, like, you know, EUROSTUDENT is the best possible data, right, about student welfare that we have in Europe, and that's the great advantage and great benefit. But when but to a large extent, the EUROSTUDENT data is about economic well-being of students, right? The student welfare, the quality of life, and so on and so on. And still, for us as the researchers, the data quality is not enough to get to produce a good quality publications on the topic of student welfare. But the prospects for the future are very promising with the introduction of the microdata and also with the standardization of the sampling and data collection since EUROSTUDENT 5. So yeah, there's still a way to go, but I think that the prospects are very nice, and this is why I also started to work with that data, because I think this is good to know what's actually in there. So, and that also relates, for example, to, because I see that Yasin mentioned about another indicator on financial situation of students, and that's the material deprivation. Yeah, exactly. This is a very good indicator besides financial difficulties, but this question has been added only recently to the survey. So the only thing that we can do with it is have a 1-year snapshot analysis. So yeah, and that's typically not enough to actually address, you know, the questions about the effects. I'm not even mentioning the causal effects, but the, you know, the kind of a empirically well-grounded relationship between the policy and the student outcomes.
So we are waiting for more and more data and new waves of EUROSTUDENT. But any other questions or comments from the audience, the last ones before we should wrap up our today's webinar? Any questions to Christoph or any comments? Seems that everyone is deeply thinking about student funding. Yeah, Anna is asking, will the results be published?
No, I don't think so. Maybe in a form of a report, because it's still like, you know, empirically, as I said, still the data quality is not good enough to produce a good scientific publication. So yeah, it can be informative in terms of, you know, actually realizing what are the cross-country differences, descriptive, explorative, as my presentation was. But yeah, at this point, I can't really turn it into a solid scientific publication. We have to wait at least for a 4-time series, I think. So as I showed you before, in the measurement section, yeah. So for now we have TISTO. So yeah, we will have to wait for more data coming from the EUROSTUDENT 8, but also with the student funding data that we collected.
So we can hope that in EUROSTUDENT 9 or 10, we still have webinars and Christoph will come and introduce the already published big research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No problem.
We are anyway wrapping up, and some people need to go to other meetings as well very soon. But first of all, I would like to say big thanks to Christoph that you came and you shared your research findings and you shared the researcher's perspective with us, and also to all the other listeners. And the last message from me would be that we are definitely continuing with EUROSTUDENT Talks. It will be already 1 year soon, but the next 2 months in July and August, we will have a short summer break. And then we should be ready for new season of EUROSTUDENT Talks. And I hope that you will be still with us also in autumn and later on. So during summer, have a nice vacation. And also, if you haven't seen some previous webinars we have had, you can still rewatch them at the EUROSTUDENT webpage through YouTube. So feel free. And once again, thank you, Christoph, and thanks everybody else who attended.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Christoph, maybe you can stay for a second.